which you, my God, have created.
All that normal stuff. But at a certain point, those no longer serve a healthy purpose. At a certain point, we need to start letting go of that and dropping the things that were the professional self that we cultivated. We're still a professional, but instead we're getting in touch with those deepest desires we thought, oh, that could never be. God would never want me that. Or sometimes some of us grow up in a theology or a religion that says that desire is a really bad thing. This is because, of course, there's perversions of desire. But this is not even like surfacey desire. This is the deepest core of who you are, that you really are an artist, that you really are a musician, that you really love working with your hands and you love having your own. You're coming into a knowing of who God created you to be. And we need to learn to trust that desires are, when they're the deepest ones, maybe discerned with a wise elder, some person in our life that we trust, that we can actually pursue that path, which is why it's so common for people to change careers multiple times throughout their life. It's not just economic circumstances, but it's also coming to realize this is really what I want to do. This is really what I want to do. And the doors open and we move in that direction. And that happens for us Benedictines too. And it's not just what Reverend Mother told us we're going to go off and do, but we become attracted to the possibility of a kind of ministry or a kind of people that we want to work with. And it comes from a deep place within our heart. That's God's will for your life. And we can be socialized into believing that anything I really want or desire is definitely not of God. It is definitely of the evil one, or however you want to articulate that. And although the desert ascetics will sometimes talk of passion in the negative, I think we need to recoup that. They're talking about the kind of passions that lead us astray, that take us away from our truest self, that cause a whirlwind of storm within ourselves so we can't focus on the things that we want to. One of the concepts that come out of the desert is purity of heart. And purity of heart doesn't mean you never have a wicked thought. I mean, I would have given up years ago if purity of heart meant you never had a wicked thought, because I do have some of those, especially when it comes to certain social things going on in the world today. My first take is always my take before I shut up and listen to what maybe God has to say. But purity of heart in the desert meant you are readjusting your inner and your outer life, wherever your situation places you, so that the first and the most important thing in your life is your interior pursuit of the divine. Making not just time for prayer, but whatever it is that moves your heart into the heart of God, as long as you're prioritizing that, that's what they meant by purity of heart. We never arrive. It's always a journey. I've certainly witnessed that with the older sisters in my own community, with the lovely several sisters I'm staying with over in your guest house. In their 90s, they're still talking about, learning new things. There's a great quote from Pablo Casals, the great cellist. They said, at 93 years old, why are you still practicing the cello? Well, I think I'm getting a little bit better. It's like, that's really what, the life in the desert was really all about. And the desert ascetics talk to us about attending to our being and not our doing. And we Americans can be horrific workaholics, absolutely terrible. We go on vacation and the first thing we're thinking about is work. We somehow have a hard time disengaging. And I am and was just as guilty. I'm working on it. I'm getting much better about letting go. But we can forget that the first and foremost thing is our being, not our doing. We can confuse our self-worth, our worthiness before others with whatever it is we do for a living or on behalf of the church or, whatever that part of our life is. The desert, though, calls us to await God's self-revelation. And that was what's so hard for me, because I can be so, at least in those days, so goal-oriented that I'm pursuing God, so damn it all, you ought to be showing up and being there for me, because here I am ready to pursue you. But when the rubble comes crashing down, I had to just sit there and wait. It was really frustrating. But that's what the desert calls us to. It calls us to sit and wait, because it's pure gift when God reveals some of God's self to us. But God desires relationship. And so really it's about peeling back those layers that I have put up, because God is ready to move in closer and closer as I am ready. And that's what that was for the desert ascetics was so important to them, is peeling back those layers, because they're yearning for an intense encounter with God. They're yearning for that one-on-one. They oftentimes, in fact, talk about wanting to become like the angels. And it can sound like they are anti-sex, anti-gender, anti-whatever, but really that's not what it meant in their language of their day. It was about moving beyond the cultural trappings of being a woman of a certain social class. And so many of the stories we have are of women who were of a certain social class, so their families paid for their life to be written. You never wrote your own autobiography. That would have just been considered appalling. It was always another person who wrote your biography. Your family might contract with a biographer. You might contract with that person, but you never wrote your own story. So we don't know the names of the bulk of the women and men who lived in the desert, because they would not have been of a class that could have afforded to have a biography written, or of course maybe they just didn't care. So the women we know about, the Paulas and the Macrinas, and Macrina was a great gal. If we have a moment, I'll share her story. But it was really about a deep encounter with the Holy One. And they call us to they talk a lot about self-awareness and self-knowledge. And really, to the extent that I know myself is the extent to which I know God. And it's not because I am God. This is not about narcissism. This is about, as I come to know my gifts and my foibles and my quirkiness, to that extent, God has revealed God's self to me, but it's not that I am God. And self-awareness is just becoming aware of, I have certain gifts, and I certainly do not have these gifts. No one is ever going to hire me to paint a painting or to write an icon or do a fresco on a wall, because I have terrible hand-eye coordination and I have unsteady hands and always have. But there are other things I can do. I can paint with words, but I cannot paint artistically. And it really isn't even a desire. No, actually, I did desire to become an iconographer because I love icons, but ain't going to happen in this world. And so I just need to accept, that's the way it is. God had other things for me to use on my time. A lot of our spiritual or ascetical theology comes out of the desert. And this is, again, where Benedict betrays his knowledge of the desert tradition. And the fancy term is ascetical theology. And the institutional church has always treated ascetical theology with deep suspicion. And many of our theologians, not just the ones in the desert like Evagrius, but all throughout the early, late medieval period and into modern times, whenever they started writing in a realm of ascetical theology, they were under suspicion for investigation by the Inquisition. They were condemned. Evagrius was condemned for years, and it was in Origen, and it was really only about 40 or 45 years ago that they came off the list. And yeah, this little part here was kind of gross. Origen, because he didn't know what to do with his sexual passions, castrated himself. And the church says, no, you don't do things like that. And so for that alone, they condemned him for about 1,000 or 1,200 years. And he had been recently resurrected that, yeah, guys, don't do that part. But these teachings over here are really quite lovely. So that you can hold on to. We finally are learning to parse out, every saint has their foibles and faults, every single solitary one of them. And so you don't declare someone a saint because they're faultless, because if they're faultless, their name is Jesus Christ, and it's the one person, the one human who passes that muster. For the rest of us, we've got to take the foibles with the faults. So one of the words, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but one of the words that the desert ascetics use is penthos, which is the gift of tears. Now, the gift of tears doesn't mean you go around the desert, hang dog, tears rolling down your face, being depressed, terrible company. Instead, penthos is this idea that you have to get in touch with the hard things that you have experienced in life, that you need to get in touch with what is wrong with this world, what is wrong with this picture, and that through the gift of tears, ideas break open. The Spirit is able to move in and touch you in a very deep way. Recently, there is an author by the name of Douglas Christie who's quite brilliant, and he has written a book called The Blue Sapphire of the Mind. His specialty is desert theology. He specialized in the early desert ascetics and their use of scripture. But that book, he looks at the ways that we need to grieve for the environmental devastation before we're actually going to be willing to change our way of life and change our priorities to try to save creation. And his book is not negative, and it's not just on penthos, but he says the first way to address our destruction of the environment is to get in touch with the reality that as species disappear, as ice shelves crack and break open, I guess we lost a whole colony of penguin babies within the last month or so when the shelf cracked and broke and all the babies fled in, dropped into the ocean and of course can't survive down there. If we can't feel that, we're not going to change anything. And that's the desert ascetics. If you can't feel the harm that your former way of life was doing to you, you're not going to be able to make the changes in your life to a healthier way of life. That's penthos. It was not meant to be a real downer, negative kind of thing. The desert ascetics also talked about prosoche. I assume I'm pronouncing that right, which is the art of paying attention. The desert ascetics truly believed that the contemplative practice was listening and paying attention. Thich Nhat Hanh will call it mindfulness, but do we notice what's going on around us? Do we notice what the creation is literally saying to us? Do we notice the body language of the person around us? Do we notice our own body language? Are we aware of the ways that slithering lies can slip into our minds? What we today would call a negative self-talk. But really paying attention. That was the gift of Thich Nhat Hanh to the United States, is he would tease us about the fact that when we're washing dishes, we're off at a board meeting. And when we're vacuuming, we're thinking about our homework assignment. And, we're never doing the thing that we're doing when we're doing it. And, he said a first step is when you're washing dishes, pay attention to the water, the soap, the dishes, the movement of your hand, that has intrinsic value in and of itself. And that's very much a desert value, is paying attention to what you're doing while you're doing it. And that helps us grow in self-awareness and self-knowledge. It also helps us with what St. Paul referred to as putting on the mind of Christ. And we also talk about living from a contemplative stance. How do you notice the Spirit moving in the world around you? How is it that you notice when the Holy Spirit is trying to nudge you awake to pay attention to something?